Hello and welcome to A Picture in a Thousand Words. I'm Michael Fadler. This is another Chapter 2, and it's a Chapter 2 as a follow-on to a previous episode involving natalizumab, which is a treatment option for multiple sclerosis. Its trade name is Tysabri, and its effects on something called neutrophil-to-lymphocyte ratio. It's a pretty complicated podcast. It's a long one, but essentially what the circumstances are is in multiple sclerosis, you have an overactive immune system. That overactive immune system chews on your myelin sheath, which is a protective coating around your neurons in your brain. And these immune cells chew on them like piranha and erode this myelin. Those neurons degrade and you get disability. That's essentially what MS is. Tysabri is a very efficacious drug for multiple sclerosis. It holds immune cells out of your brain, specifically lymphocytes, and prevents them from chewing on your myelin. And that's essentially how it works. The thrust of the podcast episode that I had, the previous Picture in a Thousand Words, is that in holding back lymphocytes, you get an increase in the number of complex immune cells, which are what lymphocytes are, in your bloodstream. So just a quick departure on lymphocytes and another immune cell type called neutrophils. They're like chess pieces. Neutrophils are small little pawn-like pieces that are easy come, easy go. And lymphocytes are more complex, nuanced back row pieces. They can do all sorts of different things. So the previous episode is all about how Tysabri shifts the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio and allows for something called a feel-good effect. Patients have this fog lifted. They feel good on Tysabri, which is what the thrust of that entire P1000 is. I suggest you take a look at it if you haven't already. It will go into much more detail on the phenomenon that I just described. So what you're looking at here is data that supports those assertions. So when I did the first P1000, I wanted to go visual and kind of give some eye candy about what I think that this cartoon illustration would look like. And now we're looking at actual data. And you should be looking at two figures that are a little complicated, but let me see if I can break them down. So across the top, it says estimated NLR in placebo and natalizumab treated subjects from AFFIRM. So NLR is neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. The acronyms are across the bottom if you missed them. Placebo are patients that don't receive anything. Natalizumab is the drug for MS, otherwise called Tysabri. And AFFIRM was a phase 3 clinical trial. It was a 2-year trial that patients receiving natalizumab, MS patients that received natalizumab, was in. That was the name of the trial. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is what happens to that neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio during the AFFIRM trial, which you can see across the bottom is about 120 weeks. And then you can see the numbers of patients. So we start out with about 600 patients for Tysabri and about 300 for placebo. And what happens is, with patients that get placebo, their neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, that gray bar at the top, is essentially flat. Maybe it fluctuates a little bit, but it's largely flat. But what happens with patients on Tysabri is it drops quite a bit. And that's what that falling drop is with the blue line. And that happens because you get many more lymphocytes in your bloodstream and your neutrophils stay the same. So your denominator in the fraction of neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio gets really big. So the aggregate number, the aggregate NLR, drops to the floor, which is what you see that in blue. So it's a pretty precipitous drop. And if you look on the right, you sort of see what that aggregate quantified number is. So for placebo, that's the gray bar on the right-hand figure. Your resting NLR during the AFFIRM trial is about 2.2. Let's just call it that. And then for Tysabri, it's about 1.25. So it's much lower. It's about a 40 to 45% decrease. And that dotted line that you see in both figures, HC, stands for healthy control. And so when I was doing this work, I pulled and extracted studies on neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. And I have a whole table that I may do another chapter 2 on. But suffice it to say, if you look at the footnote at the bottom, I found in a number of studies that look at neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio and compare them to some form of control, whether it be healthy subjects or untreated subjects or whatever it may be. And I aggregated as many healthy controls as I could and it was just under 3,000. So you and me, average person, no MS, garden variety, normal functionality, wild type, essentially, your resting NLR is about 1.74. So what I mean by this is that patients that are on Tysabri, they have an NLR that drops not only lower than placebo, but actually lower than healthy controls. So in the previous P1000, I speak about how Tysabri gives people this feel-good effect. The fog is listed, they just feel great. And it could be that it's because their neutrophil-lymphocyte ratio is very low. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to the P1000, your neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, as I mentioned earlier, this ratio between chess pieces, is essentially the temperature of your immune system, or that's how I like to describe it. And what I mean by that is a high NLR means that you have lots of neutrophils. Those are your first responders. You have a very active immune system, and that the overall ratio is high. And so in a whole host of different therapeutic areas, including COVID-19, I just found out, I was looking up that reference before I recorded this, and just this week, April 3rd, I want to say it was published, that they've shown that patients with that they've shown an elevated NLR in patients with severe forms of COVID-19. So it's a very ubiquitous marker for broad spectrum inflammation. And patients with MS have an elevated NLR, which is why those placebo patients are at about 2.2, where healthy control is about 1.7. But what you can see is that Tysabri drops that neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio quite significantly, even lower than healthy controls. And so I wanted to repost, I wanted to have a follow-on post to my previous one to show the data that backs up that previous assertion. So a lot of the analysis that I've done on this is with existing literature, and if you listen to the P1000, I talk in great detail about the publications that initially released this neutrophil and lymphocyte counts, which I then did my own, essentially, paper napkin analysis of, is what you're looking at, but I tried to make it look legit, as you can see here. But this is just quantitatively describing the effect that Tysabri has on neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. And I think that for the skeptics or those who just like to look at data rather than just colorful cartoons, this is graphically, quantitatively, numerically like what Tysabri is doing to neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. And what's nice about these data is that it's not from a single center or a sort of a smaller cohort of physicians that are aggregating data. This is actually from the clinical trial. So this is actually quite a significant number of patients. That's why the data look very clean, and it's very striking that the effect of Tysabri on neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is quite significant. So this episode is intended to be just a supplement to the previous. I definitely recommend listening to the previous episode. It goes into a lot more detail on NLR and natalizumab and multiple sclerosis and some of the more sweeping claims or assertions or hypotheses that I have regarding all of this. But I just wanted to post this one as just actually showing the graphical data of what the numbers actually look like. And it's not just fluff. But I'll post some of the same show notes if you want to find out where I pulled some of these reference from. Also include the COVID-19 article that I just found, because I just thought that was interesting. Also, an interesting fact is that COVID-19 article came from Mexico. So if you listen to the first episode, the P1000, I mentioned that a lot of NLR research comes from odd places. This was from Mexico. Previous studies have come from places like Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Kenya, all sorts of random spots, because I think that those are places that are resource poor. And so neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is a very cost-effective marker, because you're just dividing one number over another. If you did a blood panel on somebody, you're going to have these numbers. And if you have lots of neutrophils, not a lot of lymphocytes, bad things happen. That's lots of pawns, not as many back row chess pieces. Bad things are going to happen, as is the case for COVID-19. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of provide another layer of sort of scientific credibility. And this is from a publication that I tried to publish and failed. And so I may introduce more data sort of sprinkled in with some of these P1000s. You can see this is figure 2 from that paper, and the previous cartoon was sort of the synopsis. So that's why I led with that one. But I hope you enjoyed this episode, and believe me a little bit more if you hadn't already. But anyway, take care. Bye.